What is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. In today's review, we are going to be taking a look at the Ora GrapheneQ. Now, this is a Kickstarter and Indiegogo product. It did launch on both, and this headphone was provided by Ora Sound for reviews. So thanks to them for providing this. I was just loaned this in exchange for my honest feedback. I'm not paid for this in any way, and there are no affiliates for this product whatsoever. So this is just my complete and unbiased review of the Ora Sound GrapheneQ headphones. But without further ado, let's hop on into the review and just get a few of the basic specs out of the way. So a little fair warning before we get any farther into this review, I do believe this will be a longer review than usual because there is quite a bit to cover with this thing, including the technology and a few other things. So just wanted to let you all be aware of that. Now moving on into the specs. This headphone on the Kickstarter, I believe, was $3.99, but at full retail price, I believe now it is $4.99. I will correct it on screen if I am wrong. It is a closed-back headphone with an impedance of 32 ohms with a sensitivity of 106 dB a milliwatt. It is a Bluetooth headphone supporting Apdex HD. It has a frequency response of 3 to 63,000 hertz and a weight of 360 grams. Okay, so now we have to talk about the big elephant in the room, which is the graphene drivers. So the Ora Sound is the first headphone out there with a completely graphene driver diaphragm. Now, yes, I know there are other headphones out there that claim to have graphene drivers. I know a lot of people pointed to the One More triple driver over ear, which does claim to have a graphene driver. But all these other headphones that have graphene drivers really are just graphene coated or have some kind of graphene on top of a standard, usually mylar diaphragm. Whereas the Ora Sound here is a actual full graphene driver. Now you may be wondering why graphene, and I was asked to talk about this, so we will go over the technology a little bit. To put it in very simple terms, graphene is a very rigid yet light material, and basically what that allows for is a much more even pistonic motion of the driver. It allows the driver to move in a much more even motion than a traditional mylar driver in theory, which in theory is more efficient and will also reduce things like total harmonic distortion and high frequency distortion. And there are a few other benefits to the technology. So that is just a little overview of the technology. It is very cool on paper. There's a lot of reading you can do about the graphene driver tech. And yeah, on paper it is quite interesting. And we'll just show off the driver real quick so the pad just pops off. And you can see that graphene driver right there. Okay, so now is a good time to move on into the sound of the Ora GrapheneQ. So the build quality on this for $500 doesn't really feel too up to par in my opinion. A lot of it feels plasticky, like the whole thing basically feels like plastic, even though this is supposedly metal. But this is the most plasticky feeling metal I've ever encountered. I have no idea what kind of metal this is. And this is apparently wood, but it also feels like plastic. I mean, this is smooth. It's not like grinding or anything, so that's good. The top part is like a protein leather, but on the underside, there is not really much padding there. There's a very hard piece of plastic under a very thin padding there. And then you have a bit of a slide adjustment, but it's very short, which more on that in a second. On the bottom, you have USB-C charging on one side and a 3.5mm auxiliary input on the other side. On this cup here, you do have the power button as well as for pairing, and it's like answer calls, and I also believe play pause. And on this cup, you have a touch controller for like next track, last track, volume up, volume down, and it actually works quite well. It's a pretty decent touchpad controller. And as for the pads, they do have a ear-shaped pad, albeit not the deepest pad in the world. And as I already showed you before, the driver is situated more up at the top of the cup. So that is the overall build on the Ora GrapheneQ. And then as for included accessories, you do get this box, and inside there is a 3.5mm auxiliary cable, as well as a USB Type-C cable for charging. Now of note, I do find it odd that there's no included carrying case for a Bluetooth headphone, particularly at like a $500 price point, because all the other Bluetooth headphones, I know this is going to get compared to the Sony WH-1000XM3, the Bose QC35-2, even the Audeze Mobius, they all come with a carrying case. So it seems weird that there's no included carrying case with this headphone for a $500 price point, and it folds flat, and you could get this in a relatively small case for carrying in a backpack or something along those lines. Okay, so now on into the comfort of the Ora GrapheneQ. And the comfort is one of the areas where I believe this headphone suffers the most. Now, the primary issue with this headphone is this slide adjust is very, very short. It does not give you much adjustment for height on the headphone. Now, on my head, I would say I have a moderate to slightly above average head. I wear like the K371, let's see, about that far up on it, so not too big. And I think I'm about 7 or 8 clicks up on like an HD 600 series headphone, so just a point of reference. And with this all the way extended, my ear is like smashing against the bottom of the pad. And I know I've seen one of the guys, Robert Eric Graskell, I believe. Sorry if I butchered your name. I've been talking to him, and I saw him post on a few forums telling people that, if it doesn't fit your head, that you should actually wear it shorter, because the intended purpose of this is to take the pressure off the top of your head by putting all the weight or all the clamp and most of the pressure on the sides of the pads, which, if you haven't noticed, the cups don't have any sort of pivot. There's no pivot. Like this cup won't pivot, like this way. And in my opinion, this just doesn't work. The adjustment is too short, wherefore, if I do say shrink it a little bit to get some of the weight off my head, which is another problem in a second, my ear just doesn't fit. It's going to start getting, covered by the pads. So that just really does not work. And the other problem with that is, when this is extended, look how flat the top of this headband gets. It touches like maybe 2 or 3 inches of the top of your head and gives me a very, very harsh pressure point. So there's really no good way to wear this. I would definitely add back in the pivot. And I think they probably did it to remove a failure point, which is, I guess, fair, but you're sacrificing so much basic ergonomics for that. And this system, in my opinion, just does not work. And I know I've seen a few other people complain about that. So I would go back to the drawing board on the comfort and the overall fit of this headphone. Now, as for power requirements, they're not hard to drive. They're obviously Bluetooth headphones, so you will primarily be pairing them to your phone. But if you do want to plug them in, they can be used fully passively, which is quite nice because not all Bluetooth headphones can be used fully passively. So that is a big plus in my books. A good job there. But when you do want to plug them in, they don't take much power at all. They're very efficient, 32 ohms at 106 dB a milliwatt, as previously mentioned. So nothing too crazy in the power department. And once again, as for the Bluetooth, they do support Apdex HD, which is quite nice if you have a supported device that uses Apdex HD. Okay, so now moving on into the sound of the Ora GrapheneQ. So starting off with frequency response, the Ora GrapheneQ has a massive bass shelf, about a 15 dB bass shelf from about 20 to 100 hertz. It is a huge bass shelf. It extends, but it is very, very warm. After that, there is a little bit of a recession at around 200 hertz that you only notice because the mid bass and the lower mids come back up from about 4 to about 1K. They come back up about 5 dB. So you do notice a little bit of a canyon there in the sine sweep. After that, you have a little bit of a shout of like 2.5-ish K. There's a little bit of a shout there of about a dB or 2. And then after that, you actually have a big kind of a hole in the frequency response of about at around 6K. It seems to dip down about 5 or 6 dB. And then after that, the treble seems to come back up for, I hear 2 peaks in sine sweep at around 8.5 and about 9.5K. That come back up, I would say, about 5-ish dB over where your lower mids were. And there actually does seem to be a decent amount of air, but it does come off as quite bright. So the GrapheneQ is a very W-shaped signature, very, very bloated bass with a little bit of a mid peak and then treble peak. And I put up my ears graph of this, which is done using the HPN comp for the MiniDSP EARS, which tries to mimic Tile's ID comp. But Ora also gave me a measurement that they did on their MiniDSP EARS using the HEQ compensation, which is the Harman compensation. So I will go ahead and throw that up too, so you can see it compared to my normal comp and then Harman compensation from them, so you can compare and contrast those. But yeah, moving on into the rest of the sound. So as for detail, it's not that detailed, unfortunately. Now, it is more detailed than a headphone that it actually shares some pedigree with, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But for a $500 price point, it is definitely losing to the likes of the Odyssey Mobius and other passive closebacks in that price range. And then as for like other Bluetooth things, I think it's about maybe on par with the Bose, and I think a little bit behind the Sony WH-1000XM3. So unfortunately, the detail on this is not great. And unfortunately, that massive sub bass, and I guess somewhat mid bass, that big bass shelf kind of bloats things up. The mid-range comes off is shouty. There's a weird hole in like your lower treble and the very top of your upper mids. That gives this a very strange kind of sound and kind of a bright, peaky treble that kind of bothers me. I did get a headache once while listening to these, unfortunately. Now, as for Soundstage is actually decent. It's not the greatest Soundstage I've heard in a closeback, but it's certainly far from the worst. It has a overall decent Soundstage. Dynamics are okay. Once again, as far as slam goes, it doesn't slam that hard. It just has so much sub bass boost that it just seems like it slams. But as far as overall macro dynamics and microdynamics, it's okay. Nothing mind-blowing. Has okay speed. But one of the things of this graphene tech is supposed to be faster speed, which I'm really not getting from this headphone, unfortunately. Now, as for timbre, comes off a little bit plasticky, in all honesty. It's not the greatest timbre in the world. And then as for imaging, it actually images decently well. It images a lot better than I thought. It has fairly accurate and precise imaging, which I guess is good. So overall, the sound on the GrapheneQ has quite a few flaws, to say the least. Okay, so now moving on into comparisons. So one thing I want to get out the way, not to cause any sort of drama here, but just because I know this is going to come up eventually on some forum or something, and I want to address this. The GrapheneQ basically is using a modified version of the driver that's in the Creative Arvana Live. Now, once again, not to upset the company, I want to clarify this completely for both sides. So this is using the magnet, the voice coil, and like the grill and kind of overall structure of the Creative Arvana Live driver done by some Foster subsidiary. But Ora Sound custom built the cone and the surround, basically. So this is a Foster driver, whatever the 4417 some odd, whatever the driver is, that's in the Creative Arvana Live with a custom designed graphene cone and baffle. And if you take this apart and you look at the back of it, the magnet, and what looks exactly like it does on the Creative Arvana Live. So that's just something I wanted to address. And because of that, we will be doing some comparisons to the Creative Arvana Live here. So as for comparisons, I don't have the Mobius on me anymore, and I don't have the Bose or the Sony. So as for closebacks, let's start with the Cal, since this thing is going to be sharing a driver sort of, or a somewhat similar driver structure to the GrapheneQ. So obviously the Cal is much cheaper, it's not Bluetooth or whatever, so it's not a fair comparison, but people know the sound of this more or less. So the Cal is less detailed than the Ora is. I do think the Graphene Cone adds some detail over the Creative Arvana Live. However, the Cal is a much more sane tuning. This is still a warm, bassy headphone, but it is nowhere near the massive bass bloat that the GrapheneQ has. It's not a 15 dB shelf. This is a very somewhat mild downward sloping bass curve, as opposed to just a big shelf on this. So the Cal to me is a much more pleasing signature, even though it sacrifices some detail over the GrapheneQ. And then I have the K371 over here, which I touted as basically the new king of sub $200 closebacks. Now this is also not wireless. However, there is the K371BT coming out, which I've not heard yet. But if we assume the K371BT sounds exactly the same as the K371, then I think that will be a fair competitor. Because this is also not active noise canceling, so we don't have to worry about that, because the GrapheneQ is also not active noise canceling. So the K371 is Harman Target, where in the marketing material for the GrapheneQ, they were comparing it a lot to Harman Target, and they compensated to Harman Target, but they weren't going for Harman Target apparently, because their curve is nowhere near Harman Target, as you can see on their Harman EQ'd or Harman compensated graph. So this also has a little bit of a sub-bass boost, but this is 5 dB below 50 Hz, not 15 dB below 100 Hz like the GrapheneQ is. The K371 I find more detailed than the GrapheneQ is, with a much more sane and normal tuning. Much less bloated, treble's not nearly as peaky. Now the mids on this do sound more recessed than the GrapheneQ, because once again that 4-ish K hole that I mentioned on the review of the K371, but this is a much more tonally balanced headphone. The GrapheneQ is going for a very, very, very consumer-oriented signature in my opinion. It is very bassy with a decently elevated treble. So kind of V-shaped, once again I said W-shaped because of that little bit of a boosted out upper mid-range. And then the one thing I wanted to talk about here at the end of the video is kind of the overall idea of this and some constructive feedback for Ora Sound. Now, to you all, I understand that you want to be a driver OEM primarily. At least that's what it seems to me. You all have a bunch of other driver types out there for like headphones and speakers and a few other things. And to me, it seems like you want to be a driver OEM, which is totally respectable. And this headphone was your proof of concept of the technology. And the technology on paper is really good. It's a good technology on paper. The problem is it was not executed in a way that I think can really show off your technology. And there's a few reasons why. Once again, the tuning. It is a very, very consumer-oriented tuning, which I get that probably a lot of the people that bought this headphone are general consumers. But for the audiophiles out there, I feel most of them are going to find this way, way too bassy for their type of listening. This is a much more consumer-oriented thing. Like, this is on Beats level of bass boost. And actually, I'm not even joking. I mean, you can look at a graph of a modern Beats headphone. It's about this bassy. So that's the first problem, is that the tuning is gimping your overall driver technology. It just doesn't work with this kind of tuning. The second problem is that you're kind of also gimping your driver by doing a closeback headphone, because closeback headphones are always going to be sacrificed compared to open headphones. There's always going to be sacrifices in detail and openness and width and such. So I really feel you all should have done an open back headphone. And then you're further also holding it back somewhat by using Bluetooth, because Bluetooth is obviously going to be somewhat lossy and you are relying upon the internal amps, but luckily you can bypass it, and most of my testing was done passively, just so I was not held back at all by the internal amplifiers. And in my opinion, if you're trying to prove a technology like this, you come out with your best foot forward. Now, I understand this is more appealing and you probably did earn more money this way. It's more attainable to your average consumer, and if you want to develop your driver tech, I understand you need the money, and you probably got a lot more sales this way. I totally understand that. But when you're trying to prove a technology, you go all out. You should have done a flagship open back headphone that proves the technology, that proves that this is a viable technology in today's market. And what was done here was a much more consumer-oriented product that I feel doesn't show off any of the benefits that this technology shows on paper. And I would love to see a open back headphone from you all using this technology, because unfortunately this does not show off the technology that you can possibly have. And this is kind of like what Elon Musk said about about Tesla. There was like a forum post from Elon Musk in 2006, I believe, where he said, the plan is to come out with a sports car to make money, to prove the technology, to make a cheaper car, to once again further prove the technology, to be once again make a cheaper car. When you come out with a new technology, you want to start at the absolute top and trickle down. You don't want to start down and work your way up. And in my opinion, that's what they should have done. They should have started at the top and allowed this tech to trickle down instead of starting down and trying to work their way up. So that is just my opinion on the general business structure and the design philosophy behind this headphone. So in conclusion, the GrapheneQ will not be getting my recommendation. The sound is way too bassy with some peaky treble, and it sacrifices way too much in terms of the comfort, in my opinion. Once again, technology is great on paper, but the execution does not prove the technology, at least in my opinion. So once again, please make an open back passive headphone, and I would love to check that out if you ever do that. But in the current state, I unfortunately cannot recommend the Ora GrapheneQ. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the GrapheneQ. Thanks again to Ora for sending this out. I hope you take my feedback constructively. But if you do want to buy these, I will link them in the description below, as well as my Twitter, the Ears Graph, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, look forward to seeing you in the next review. Bye.